Hi everybody, this is Adam. Today we're going to be talking about arguments in a slightly different way than we have before. Up until now we've been talking about what makes arguments good, what makes them succeed, and the sorts of properties that they should have. For example, they should, if they're deductive arguments, they should be valid. If they're inductive arguments, they should at least be strong, and we looked at some common forms of deductive arguments. We looked at modus ponens, modus tollens, the hypothetical syllogism, and the disjunctive syllogism. Today we're going to be looking at bad arguments, and in fact, a specific way that arguments can go bad. We're going to be talking about arguments that are fallacious, or we're going to be talking about fallacies. Now, a fallacy is something that's just a little more specific than a mere bad argument or mere bogus reasoning. A fallacy is a bad argument that is kind of tricky. It's a little sneaky. At first glance, it looks like a better argument than it actually is, and it's only on closer inspection that we realize that the support that's being offered for the conclusion by the premises really isn't that good. So we're going to break this up into four families of fallacies that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about formal fallacies, we're going to talk about fallacies of relevance, we're going to talk about fallacies of presumption, and fallacies of ambiguity. So let's start with formal fallacies. Formal fallacies all go wrong in roughly the same way, namely there's something off about their formal structure. And this relates to deductively valid arguments, mostly because, if you guys can recall from previous lessons, what it is that makes an argument deductively valid is something that has nothing to do with its content and everything to do with its structural form. So, for example, when we looked at modus ponens, we noticed that anything that takes the form of if P then Q, P therefore Q, any argument like that with two premises of one is an if-then statement and the next one says yes to or affirms the if part or the antecedent of that if-then statement, then we'll be able to validly conclude an affirmation of the then part of the if-then statement. And that's pretty much modus ponens. If we were going to describe modus ponens in a slightly different way, we might say that it's an argument that affirms the antecedent in order to affirm the consequent. That's the method of putting by putting. But if we confuse the antecedent and the consequent in that if-then statement, if we kind of tweak the formal structure of modus ponens just a little bit, we can get an argument that to the untrained eye may be able to be passed off as modus ponens, but we can quickly see, just with a little bit of careful attention, that it's not modus ponens, and in fact it's not a valid argument at all. So this is a clear case of a formal fallacy, something that looks at least kind of like has a passing similarity to a valid argument, but it itself is not a valid argument. And this is what makes it tricky. This is what makes it not only bogus, but bogus in a way that can easily fool folks who aren't paying very close attention. We call that fallacy, that formal fallacy that looks a bit like modus ponens, but isn't really quite it, affirming the consequent. And we'll notice there that the form that it takes, if P then Q, Q therefore P, is a form that where I start out with an if-then statement and my second premise says yes to or affirms the consequent, the then part of my if-then statement, and tries to draw a conclusion where I say yes to or I affirm the antecedent as a conclusion. That's why we call this one affirming the consequent, and it's fallacious because it's not valid, but it looks a little bit like our valid modus ponens argument. So you might also remember, in addition to modus ponens, we looked at modus tollens. And modus tollens is a little bit more complicated. It's a little easier to kind of maybe get confused about modus tollens because, well, we're not following the if-then statement in a forwards direction. We're not proceeding from the if part to the then part. We're trying to go backwards from the then part to the if part, and we realize we can't really do that. That would be affirming the consequent. That would be an invalid argument like we saw before. But we might be able to say not Q, therefore not P, if we start out with an if P then Q statement. That's modus tollens. If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And that's valid every time. And if you're not paying very close attention, you might confuse that for an argument that looks like this. If P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And again, this is nothing more than just a matter of confusing the antecedent and the consequent, or confusing exactly how necessity and sufficiency work with an if-then statement, and what sort of next premise I can introduce, and what sorts of conclusions I can draw that would be valid. So again, we have modus tollens, which is always valid, and then this other thing that looks a little bit like it, but not quite. There's something wrong with its structural form, and we'll call that one denying the antecedent, because it goes if P, then Q, and then not P, or it denies the P, denies the antecedent of that if-then statement, and tries to draw a conclusion that's a denial of the consequent. That's denying the antecedent, and hopefully we can see how it's not just bogus, but bogus in a tricky way, and this is what makes it a fallacy. Last but not least, amongst the formal fallacies that we'll look at today, we've got affirming a disjunct. And this is one that mimics the disjunctive syllogism. We might remember the disjunctive syllogism as the argument that starts out as P or Q, has a second premise that says not P. And on the basis of saying P or Q and that P is not the case, we know that we can validly conclude Q. That's how the disjunctive syllogism works. Sometimes folks might be tempted to say P or Q, P, therefore not Q. And that has a passing similarity to the disjunctive syllogism, but we can see at a glance that once we look at just its structural form, it's not really quite the same. This is an argument that is valid and does work so long as the or in P or Q is an exclusive sense of or, which is to say it's one or the other and can't be both. But we talked at our last meeting about how or is ambiguous, and sometimes or is meant in an inclusive sense. And if we mean or in an inclusive sense, then that affirming a disjunct structure, that one that goes P or Q, P therefore not Q, it isn't valid. Just to reiterate that, affirming a disjunct valid for an exclusive sense of or, but invalid for an inclusive sense of or. And this is what makes affirming a disjunct a little bit tricky. Looks like it could be a good argument, but maybe not as good as we think it is. We have to look a little bit closer. We have to be a little more careful. All of these share something. There's something about the way that they've busted, something about the way that these arguments break that reveals something interesting, not just about why it is that those busted arguments are bogus, but what it is about good arguments that actually does make them tick. And for all of these, it has to do with something that's either gone right or gone wrong in their structural form. And for that reason, we group them together. We call them all formal fallacies. Okay. So in addition to that big family of formal fallacies, we also have a big family of fallacies that go wrong because there's just something about the premises that the reason why they don't support the conclusion is that they're just not relevant to it. They kind of distract us and try to get us thinking about something else that seems maybe like, I don't know, tangentially related to the conclusion, but in fact doesn't really have any relevance at all, or is not as relevant as we might think it is to the conclusion. So a fairly common, or at least well-known, version of this sort of fallacy of relevance is the whole family of ad hominem arguments. Argumentum ad hominem just means argument to the man, and or to the person. And that pretty well describes what's going on in an ad hominem argument. Specifically, an ad hominem fallacy shifts the focus from the argument to the arguer. And so long as we're saying that that's a fallacious move, what we're suggesting is that that focus on the arguer is not exactly relevant to what the question under consideration is, which is like, what's the quality of the argument, or is the conclusion that's being drawn true or false? So for example, we might look at the abusive strain of the ad hominem argument. This is one where we're directly attacking somebody's character in order to somehow cast doubt on the position that they're taking or the argument that they're offering. So the example that we have here is Paul says, rather than making new gun control laws, I think we should enforce the ones that are already on the books. And Ringo says something like, or we could follow the advice of somebody who didn't cheat on their wife. Ringo seems to be somehow casting some sort of doubt on the position that Paul is making and the argument that he's offering for it, But it seems like the way that he does that, by kind of maybe raising questions about his character and that he cheated on his wife, it just doesn't seem relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn there. This is maybe one of the more familiar sorts of fallacies of relevance, because it's one that we encounter from a very young age. Children are really, really great at abusive ad hominem. Any sort of dispute between children that somehow ends in somebody being called a poo-poo head is one where we see that the focus of the discussion is being shifted away from whatever it is that was being argued to now this question of whether or not the person being accused of a poo-poo head is in fact a poo-poo head. And what's really, really tricky about abusive ad hominems is that, you know, they're incredibly tempting. It's incredibly tempting to take the bait, especially if the person whose character is being maligned in the ad hominem argument is you. There's a desire to defend yourself, to say, no, wait a minute, I'm not a poo-poo head. But now, once you've taken that bait, you realize that, like, you've kind of given in. You're now debating whether or not you're a poo-poo head. You're debating in a way where you're trying to offer arguments that defend your own character, and that's not what you were trying to do in the first place. You've been either systematically or accidentally taken off topic, and that's a problem. There's a fallacy of relevance at work there. That's abusive ad hominem. We also have something that's fairly similar, not necessarily abusive, but what's going on is we're casting some doubt on an argument or a position because the person who's advocating for it is somehow, I don't know, they would benefit from it, they have a dog in the fight, there's something about their circumstances, or there's something about the source of, this is why it's called a genetic fallacy, there's something about the source or the genesis of the position that's being considered that is allegedly making it doubtful. And this is fallacious if that's just not relevant. So for example, Daryl says, I think that unemployment benefits should be extended, and John says, well, you would say that, you're unemployed. And we're left kind of wondering here whether or not what John is pointing out here, that the fact that Daryl is unemployed, really should cast any doubt on whether or not he believes that unemployment benefits should be extended, or whether or not unemployment benefits actually should be extended. The mere fact that Daryl seems to have a dog in this fight, that he stands to benefit from unemployment benefits being extended, literally, right? He's getting benefits. That mere fact doesn't mean that he's incorrect. We would have to look to the reasons that Daryl offers, and if John wants to offer a counter-argument, he needs to actually point out why those reasons are not good ones, or offer a genuine counter-argument for why unemployment benefits should not be extended. Just pointing out that Daryl is possibly biased about this isn't enough to make us think that Daryl's wrong. And this is, I think, something important. It's going to come up again when we look at journalistic sources and news literacy. We need to be careful with how irresponsibly we might wield these accusations of bias. Bias is a good reason to be extra special careful about something. Bias is maybe a good reason to grant heightened scrutiny, to be maybe a little bit less trusting. But an accusation of bias doesn't automatically mean that somebody is wrong. It doesn't, in fact, give us any reason to think that somebody's wrong. It just gives us maybe some reason to think that they might not be seeing something 100% clearly. Biased people are right occasionally. Folks who have a dog in the fight do take up accurate positions, do give good arguments from time to time. And for that reason, an attempt to shift the focus of the conversation onto the bias of the person involved or onto the circumstances that they're in seems like it's just not relevant to the question being examined. Similar to this, and another fairly common one, is the et tu quoque strain of the ad hominem argument. So all of these are ad hominem arguments because they're all shifting attention away from the topic of discussion and to the person who's making the argument, to the person who's engaged in the discussion. And these are all, again, forms of fallacies of relevance. So the et tu quoque, literally and you as well, fallacy, is one where an accusation of hypocrisy is supposed that accusation of hypocrisy is put forward as if it somehow casts doubt on the position that the hypocrite, or the person who's allegedly a hypocrite, has staked out. So for example, we have here Simon notes that he believes that eating meat is wrong, and Nick says, but I saw you eating a cheeseburger earlier today, and Simon says, so, and Nick says, so, well, so I don't see why I should take you seriously if you're a hypocrite. Now, whether or not Simon is a hypocrite is one question, and maybe whether or not Simon is a hypocrite makes me think twice about how seriously I take him. But it seems like it has nothing to do with whether or not eating meat is wrong. And one way that we can think about this is that Simon might confess that he'll say something like, yeah, it's true, I was eating a cheeseburger earlier today. That doesn't mean that I've stopped thinking that eating meat is wrong. It just means that, you know, I'm occasionally weak-willed, that I'm a sinner just like everybody else, and I don't always do what I believe is right. The mere pointing out that somebody is a hypocrite, the mere pointing out that somebody doesn't practice what they're preaching, doesn't mean that what they're preaching isn't good to believe. And all that we're pointing out here with an et tu quoque fallacy is that anytime that somebody does shift from the topic of discussion to the potential hypocrisy of somebody who's involved in that discussion, they're changing the subject. They're engaging in an argument that's not relevant to the original argument. And it seems like sometimes we can get, if we're not careful, we can get kind of dragged from thinking that these irrelevant premises somehow get us to the conclusion that this person who's being somehow maligned in the ad hominem argument is taking up a position that we should disbelieve, that we should kind of discount what they're saying. And it's just not a very reliable way of arguing, and this is why we call it fallacious. So that's one form of fallacy of relevance. There are others. For example, we can look at argumentum ad populum, which is just fancy talk for an appeal to popularity, and this is merely noting that just because an idea is popular, just because lots of people believe it, that doesn't make it true. That should be fairly obvious. Another fairly obvious one, although, you know, when you stop and think about this one, it maybe is a little bit tricky, is an argumentum ad baculum fallacy, which is literally appeal to the stick or appeal to force. Argumentum ad baculum is basically a threat masquerading as an argument. So we're saying something effectively like, you should believe X, and we say, well, why should we believe X? And the other person responds, you should believe X because if you don't, I'll sock you in the nose. This is maybe, it seems almost like they're giving a reason, kinda, sort of, but it's a reason that seems like it has nothing to do with the truth of the belief, right? And so in that sense, it seems to be missing the point. This is why it qualifies as a fallacy of relevance. We could also move on to another one that's fairly common and kind of fairly obvious as to why it misses the mark, why it doesn't actually provide any rational support for the conclusion that it seems to be leaning towards, is this argumentum ad misericordiam, which means appeal to pity. This is something that all of your professors see from their students towards the end of the semester. We get this huge influx of students who tell us how important it is that their grade be raised from the grade that they currently have in the gradebook. And when we ask for an explanation as to why we should believe them that their grade should be raised, they give us a very, very sad story about all of the things that happened to them that semester and all of the terrible things that will happen to them if they get a bad grade in this class. And all of these things are very touching, and your professors, I would say by and large, at least if they're anything like me, our hearts go out to these poor, unfortunate students. And we want to help them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to change their grade. Because whether or not you're sad because of the grade that you whether or not you might be sad because of the grade you get has nothing to do with whether or not that grade is appropriate or accurate. And this, again, is why this is a fallacy of relevance. The fact that a particular opinion or a particular action would make somebody sad is not a good enough reason all on its own to say that it's false or that it shouldn't be done. Here's another one that's maybe a little less obvious. This one's called argumentum ad ignoratium. This is literally an appeal to ignorance. And you see this sometimes with folks who are trying to argue for some kind of position about something that's, I don't know, maybe supernatural or maybe beyond the kind of commonly accepted or scientifically accepted set of beliefs. So the example that we have here is actually a really good example of an appeal to ignorance. Tim says, of course there's intelligent alien life out there, and Tammy asks, well, why would you say that? And Tim says, well, there's just so much that we don't know about the universe. Tim's pointing out that there's a whole lot that we don't know about the universe. Seems like it's the sort of thing that, well, it's hard to understand how our not knowing something could be a reason that would get us to believe that we do know something, right? How is it that our not knowing things about the universe gets us to the point where I can believe that there's intelligent alien life out there? At most, pointing out our ignorance about some topic should be enough to get us to think that we should suspend belief on some sort of question in that topic. Pointing out that we don't know much about the universe maybe says, well, then we're not sure if there's intelligent alien life out there or not. But Tim seems to go a step beyond this, and that seems a little weird. He's saying that because we don't know much about the universe, or because there's so much that we don't know about the universe, therefore we should believe that intelligent alien life does exist. And that seems very, very peculiar. It's a fallacy of relevance, because our ignorance about something seems completely irrelevant to whether or not we should believe some particular thing. At most, it tells us that we should suspend judgment on that issue. So yet another fallacy of relevance, this appeal to ignorance. Straw man argument is a fairly important one that I think we should maybe stop for a moment and make sure that we understand why this is a fallacy. I think it's important for a variety of reasons. Maybe the biggest of those is that it's very common and it's kind of hard to pick up on when it actually happens. A straw man argument is really nothing more than portraying some opposing position or some opposing argument as weaker than it actually is. So the example that we have here is Alice says something like, I don't think that mandatory prayer in schools should be allowed, and Bob says, so then you're saying that schools should teach atheism then. Obviously the big problem there is that Bob is kind of pinning Alice to this position that she's saying that schools should teach atheism, when that's not really what she said. She said something that was maybe, I don't know, maybe some people might think that it's a similar position, saying that schools should teach atheism, but it's not exactly the same, and I think that my sense there is that Alice is maybe not interested in trying to defend the position that Bob is attributing to her. The reason why we call this a straw man argument is because it's almost as if Bob is kind of constructing some kind of fake version of Alice's position, almost like he's making a scarecrow version of somebody and then demolishing that fake version as if he somehow defeated Alice's position or somehow defeated Alice's argument. And clearly this would count as a fallacy of relevance so long as the straw man that Bob is setting up and knocking down is really just not relevant to the position that Alice is taking, if it's not the same position. To the extent that the straw man version is different than the position that Alice actually articulates, that's going to make this argument that Bob is making more and more irrelevant to Alice's actual position. So, that's straw man, and hopefully we can see why it's bad, and hopefully we can see why this is something that we all do have a tendency to fall prey to. And a lot of this has to do with just not really getting enough exposure to people who genuinely do hold beliefs that are very, very different than our own. And we're left to our own devices to try to imagine what sorts of reasons people might have for holding those beliefs, or what sorts of positions those might be. And when we're inventing those counter positions to our own, sometimes we're just not very charitable towards those other people who disagree with us. We automatically assume that they're somehow stupid or evil, and this causes us to construct a weaker, more ridiculous version of their position in our minds. And when we argue against those, it just seems like we're missing the point. We're doing something that's irrelevant. As an antidote to this, we might take up something like the principle of charity, which kind of directs us to do the opposite of what a straw man argument does. A straw man argument interprets somebody's position or argument as a more ridiculous, or in a weaker or a more extreme version of what they're actually trying to say. Whereas the principle of charity is going to say that we need to make an effort to portray opposing positions as reasonable as possible, or in the most reasonable light that we can muster. And really the spirit behind this is that, look, if you're really looking to defeat somebody else's position, if you're really trying to demonstrate why it's wrong, you want to defeat the strongest version of that position that you can find. We might think of some sort of I guess kind of like a sports analogy for this too. If you're playing some other team and you really want that game to mean something, you want to beat them, and you really want it to be the sort of thing where it's kind of like everybody knows that yeah, we totally beat that team. You want to beat them healthy and fairly and with all of their starters there. If you beat them with all of their starters injured and out, it's kind of like there's always going to be an asterisk over that victory. And we can say the same thing about engaging in arguments too. I really kind of shy away from thinking about arguments as being used to defeat other people or as part of like a competition, but at least in this sense, it seems like it's somewhat appropriate. If you're looking to bring a position down, and you want that to be somehow meaningful, you want to bring down the strongest possible version of that position. You want to show that that very charitably constructed version of the position is wrong, and that means that we know that like the strongest version of that position has been taken out, and yeah. Okay, moving on. Red herring. Red herring, I really won't talk much about this. Red herring is kind of like a catch-all category for any kind of attempt to just radically change the subject in the middle of a conversation. This is one that happens with me and my wife frequently at home. We might be arguing over who was the last person to do the dishes and who should be doing the dishes tonight. And somehow in the middle of this conversation, we get, kind of like taken on various tangents that seem like they're just not particularly relevant to the conversation at hand. So like we'll talk about, we're supposed to be talking about the dishes and who should do the dishes, and suddenly we're talking about how I don't put the toilet seat down and I leave my laundry right next to the hamper instead of putting it in the hamper. And it seems like this is just changing the subject. It's not relevant to the issue at hand. And so bringing it up is a fallacy of relevance. All of these are fallacies of relevance. They all go wrong because the premises are failing to support the conclusion, and they're tricky because it seems like they are saying something that's relevant to the conclusion, but on closer inspection we realize it's not. And I want to make it clear that not every single effort to shift the focus or to like bring somebody's character, bring an arguer's character to the forefront, which would be an ad hominem argument, right? To like make the argument about the person. Not every single time that we do that is going to be a fallacy. For example, if we're wondering whether or not somebody should be elected to public office, and somebody points out that their character is really terrible, that they're a liar and a cheater, then it seems like their character is actually relevant to this question of whether or not they should be elected to public office. So just because you're bringing somebody's character up as an issue in an argument, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're committing an ad hominem fallacy. The same way that an appeal to popularity isn't always a fallacy. There are plenty of instances in which pointing to the popularity of some idea is a very good reason to take that idea seriously. For example, if we're talking about an elected official in a democratic community, if we're wondering who should be the leader, well, it seems like there's good reason to believe that the person that the most people think should be the leader, they should be the leader. There's at least some reason to believe that. The popularity of that leader is a relevant factor. It's just that the popularity of an idea isn't always relevant to whether or not that idea is true. We can say the same thing about an appeal to pity. An appeal to pity might very well be a moving, rational argument. If I say that we should all donate to famine relief, and you ask me why, and I show you video footage of some, small children that are starving in a refugee camp, I'm trying to elicit some pity for those children. I'm trying to get some sort of emotional response from you, but that emotional response seems to be fairly relevant to this question of whether or not we should help these people. And notice how that's different, that the relevance of our pity for somebody who's starving to death is different than the relevance of my pity for somebody who will not get into law school if I don't raise their grade for them, right? So that we should be thinking, especially with these fallacies of relevance, about whether or not the premises that are on offer are actually relevant to the conclusion. That's going to be the key to whether or not the argument that's on offer is fallacious or not. If it's relevant to the conclusion, if it gives good reasons for why the conclusion should be believed, then fine. That's a plausible argument. If those reasons are not relevant, then obviously it's a bad argument. We just need the fallacies of relevance point out that we need to be careful about that. Okay. Moving on to a whole different family. These are what are known as fallacies of presumption. And fallacies of presumption all mess up in a similar way because they seem to be making some kind of assumption or presumption that, maybe shouldn't necessarily be allowed. For example, false dilemma is a fairly common form of a fallacy of presumption. And the way that a false dilemma works is that it puts forth an either-or premise and then tries to move on from that either-or premise when that either-or premise isn't really warranted. There's a really famous example of this from 2002, January 2002, when President George W. Bush spoke to Congress after September 11th and said that foreign nations need to be on notice that they are either with us or they're with the terrorists. So let's start with this either-or premise. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. This is a very powerful premise. Any kind of either-or premise is incredibly powerful. You can do amazing things with it in your arguments. For example, you can do a disjunctive syllogism, and that's what we try to do here. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. You aren't with us, so I guess that must mean that you're with the terrorists. And obviously what's problematic with this is that that either-or premise is just not true. I mentioned either-or premises are very powerful, but my sense is that their true either-or premises are a little harder to come by than a lot of people seem to assume. So if we look at something like you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, well, there are more options than besides those two. It doesn't have to be the case that either somebody is with us or they're with the terrorists. They could be with both camps. They could say, like, look, I see where you're both coming from. Or they could be against both camps. They could just say, you know, to hell with you guys and to hell with the terrorists. And we might find this familiar, not so much in trying to mediate between, you know, governments and terrorist groups, but I don't know, anytime you've had a dispute between two friends, or anytime that you've known a couple that breaks up, and then the two people in the, you know, the recently broken up couple are trying to get you to take sides in their disputes. As if those are the only two options, right? As if, like, you're either with this person or you're with the other person. You could be with both. You could be against both. You could just not care. The fact that this either-or is a false either-or is what makes this a false dilemma. It's what makes it fallacious, and precisely, it's what makes it fallacious in this way that presumes or assumes something that's just not true. And what's being assumed or presumed here is that either-or premise. So that's a false dilemma. We can also see the same sort of principles of kind of illicit presumption at work in things like complex questions, sometimes called loaded questions, where baked into a question, we've already assumed some fact, and there seems to be no way to answer that question without somehow conceding that point. The only way to kind of challenge that illicit assumption is to just reject the premise of the question altogether. So, for example, we have this example here. Smith asks Jones, "Have you stopped beating your wife yet?" And Jones says, "No, I haven't." And Smith, you know, chimes in and says, "So then you're still beating her if you haven't stopped beating your wife yet." And Jones kind of gets all flustered and says, I mean, yes, I guess. And Smith says, "Oh, so there you agree that you were beating her before you stopped." It seems like there's no way for Jones to actually answer this question without conceding this point that he must have beat his wife at some point. And the only way for him to challenge that is just to reject the question out of hand. So again, this complex question, if there's something fallacious about it, it's because we're assuming something that isn't necessarily well-grounded. The same sort of thing goes on in what's known as a politician syllogism. I'll let you guess at why we call this a politician syllogism. Basically, this is any argument that takes the form roughly of this. Premise 1, something must be done about this issue. Premise 2, here's a policy that does something about this issue. Therefore, conclusion. Statement 3, we must enact this policy. And what we're assuming here, what we're presuming here, is that the policy that's being offered as a response to the issue is the only policy on offer, or that it's the best policy on offer. Just because something is a problem worth fixing, and just because this would fix the problem, that doesn't mean that we should do this. There might be other routes to fixing the problem that would be better than the one that's being offered. Last but not least, in fallacies of presumption, is a pair of fallacies that are really closely related, and I think are really important because they reveal something that's kind of at the soul of what it is that makes any good argument tick. And the fact that these are fallacious arguments seems to kind of hinge on some sort of misunderstanding about exactly what it is that supporting reasons do when they support a conclusion. So an argument that begs the question, sometimes we might refer to this as a circular argument, although technically these are slightly different things. are scenarios where the premises that are being offered are less believable than the conclusion that they're supposed to be supporting. That's an argument that begs the question, where the premises are less believable than the conclusion that they're supposed to be supporting. A circular argument we might think of as a very special case of begging the question, where we would say something like, you would have to believe the conclusion in order to believe the premises that are being offered to support the conclusion. So here's an example of a circular argument. It's the one that's right there. Rob is interviewing Candace for a job, and Rob asks Candace, so do you have any references that I can talk to who can speak to your trustworthiness? And Candace says, sure thing. Here's a number for my friend Selena. She'll be happy to tell you how trustworthy I am. And Rob says, I don't know this Selena. How do I know that she's trustworthy? And Candace says, oh, she's totally trustworthy. Trust me. I'll vouch for her. So what's going on here? Rob wants to know whether or not Candace is trustworthy, and Candace is giving him reasons to believe that he's trustworthy, but if we follow those reasons up, we notice something peculiar has happened. Candace says, you can trust me because Selena says that I'm trustworthy. And then we wonder, well, can we trust Selena? And Candace says, yeah, you can trust Selena. Trust me. I'll vouch for her. Well, the only way that we could believe that Candace is trustworthy is if we believe that Selena's testimony that says that Candace is trustworthy is itself trustworthy. And the only way that we're going to believe that Selena is trustworthy is if we believe Candace when she says that she'll vouch for Selena. But how can we believe Candace if we're not sure whether or not we should believe Candace? And in fact, that's exactly the thing that starts this whole question off in the first place. This is why we call it begging the question. There's a question under consideration here. Rob wants to know, should he trust Candace? And every answer that he's given, when he kind of like follows it up, it looks like it leads back to this assumption that Candace is already trustworthy. And that's just not how support works. We might think of it like somebody who's sitting in a chair trying to lift themselves and the chair up off the floor at the same time. This is not the sort of thing that can be done, no matter how strong you are, no matter how often you go to the gym and how much you work out. You're never going to be able to sit on a chair and lift both yourself and the chair up off the ground as if you were levitating. It's not a question of strength. It's a question of how lifting works, right? The thing that's doing the lifting can't also be the thing that's being lifted. And support works the same way. It works this way in an architectural sense. The thing that's offering the support can't be the same thing as the thing that's getting the support. And it works metaphorically when we're thinking about the support that's offered in arguments, right? The conclusion is getting the support. It can't be the thing that's offering support to the premises as well. We might think about this in terms of other sorts of examples, like somebody says, I don't know, something like, God exists, and we wonder, well, why do you think that God exists? And they say, well, it says in the Bible that God exists. And we say, well, why should we trust the Bible? And they say, well, the Bible is the unerring word of God. Well, if I didn't believe that God exists, then I'm not going to believe that the Bible is the unerring word of God. And that's the evidence that's being provided for why I should believe that God exists in the first place. That argument is circular. It doesn't work. We can think of other softer versions of this where the premises that are being offered don't necessarily assume that we already believe the conclusion, but maybe they're just more far-fetched than the conclusion is, in which case we would wonder, like, well, why would we go through the premises to get to the conclusion? If the conclusion is more believable than the premises are, then we would just go straight for the conclusion and not bother with trying to go through these far-fetched reasons. So these are all making some sort of assumption or presumption, and that assumption or presumption seems like we're already assuming or we're already presuming that the conclusion is true in order to demonstrate that the conclusion should be believed to be true. And that's just not how arguments work, and that's why this is yet another fallacy of presumption. Last but not least, in terms of these categories that we're looking at today, we've got fallacies of ambiguity. And fallacies of ambiguity all have to do with kind of fuzzy definitions for our words. We spoke briefly in our last class session about how important it is that we define our terms and that we can define terms very, very well. We can do it very precisely if we're offering conditions that are simultaneously necessary and sufficient for membership in some sort of category. Fallacies of ambiguity are where this has kind of gone haywire, where we don't have clear definitions for our terms and where it gets us into trouble in our arguments. For example, equivocation is a fallacy where we use one term in more than one way throughout the argument. For example, we can see there an argument that says that noisy children are a headache, and 2 aspirin can make a headache go away. Therefore, it seems that 2 aspirin can make noisy children go away. Now, obviously, something funny has gone on in that argument, and if we trace it back, we can figure out what's gone wrong. It looks on its surface like it has some kind of deductive validity to it, but quickly we recognize that when we say that noisy children are a headache, we don't mean that literally. What we mean is that noisy children may cause a headache. What gets us into trouble there is saying that noisy children are a headache and that 2 aspirin can make a headache go away, therefore the 2 aspirin can make noisy children go away. The noisy children might give you a headache and you can take 2 aspirin and the headache would go away, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make the noisy children go away. Clearly what's going wrong here is that we're just being a little sloppy with our language. And we can do this in ways that aren't necessarily about words kind of slipping from one meaning to another as we speak, but we can do it with respect to ambiguous grammatical structures in our statements as well. So for example, Bill says, I broke my arm in 2 places, and Ted says, where? And Bill says, in Hawaii. And then Ted asks, well, where was the other place that you broke your arm? And when we look back on that, we recognize that I broke my arm in 2 places is an ambiguous sort of statement. Does Bill mean there that he broke his arm in Hawaii and then, I don't know, like a week later he broke his arm again in the Philippines? Or does he mean that he broke his arm in 2 different places on his arm in one single event? Another version of amphibly, one that's kind of quite famous, and a lot of these are kind of jokey because they're plays on language. There's an old Marx Brothers joke where somebody says, I shot an elephant in my pajamas this morning, and somebody else responds, well, what the hell was the elephant doing in your pajamas? This is not so much that we have words whose meanings are ambiguous, but we have sentence structures that can be interpreted in more than one way. And obviously, we can get into trouble in arguments if we're not clear on what it is that our statements mean and how they're supposed to be interpreted. Here's another sort of thing where there's a little bit of lack of clarity, right? Or there's some kind of ambiguity or vagueness in our language, and that leads to problems in our arguments. This is what's known as a fallacy of composition, and it has to do with confusion of the relationship between parts and wholes. So for example, if I said that cats were made up of atoms, and I also noted that atoms are invisible to the naked eye, and I tried to conclude from that that therefore cats must be invisible to the naked eye, and we kind of heard that argument and thought to ourselves, something must be wrong with that, because we know that cats are not invisible to the naked eye, and I'm pretty sure that cats are made up of atoms, and I'm pretty sure that atoms are invisible to the naked eye. So what went wrong there? How did I get 2 true premises that led me to a false conclusion when that looks so... honestly, it looks like there's nothing wrong with that argument. Well, the thing that is wrong about the argument is that I assumed that just because something is true of the parts, it must be true of the whole as well. So the parts of the cat might be invisible to the naked eye, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole cat is invisible to the naked eye. This is called the fallacy of composition because in kind of this movement from the parts to the whole, we're trying to compose the whole out of the parts, right? It's a fallacy of composition because we think that just because something is true about the parts, it must be true about the whole. And this works in the reverse as well. We can talk about assuming that just because something is true about the whole, that means that there must also be something true about its parts, is what's known as the fallacy of division. And here's an example of that. We might note that table salt is safe to eat, and we'll also note that table salt is composed of sodium and chlorine. Therefore, it seems like it would be the case that pure sodium and pure chlorine would be safe to eat, but that is most decidedly not true, and that argument's no good. And the reason why it's no good is that we seem to be assuming that just because something is true of the whole, it must be true of the component parts as well. And that's not necessarily the case. This ambiguity between the parts and the whole is what leads to the confusion, and what leads to this not just being a bogus argument, but a fallacious one that's sneaky and easy to miss if you're not being very careful. There are plenty of other sorts of arguments that have to do with unclear language. No true Scotsman is one that tends to pop up whenever the categories that we're working with are a little vague and ambiguous. Technically, this isn't a problem with ambiguity. This is a problem with excessively narrow use of a term. That there maybe should be a little more vagueness. There should be a little more ambiguity. Sometimes this is what's known as persuasive definition, or the fallacy of persuasive definition. And basically it involves conveniently defining your terms in such a way that you can kind of rig a particular conclusion to come out, even if the way that you're defining your terms is a little bit artificial. This is called the no true Scotsman argument because of a famous example that's used to demonstrate what's fallacious about it. And it goes a little something like this. Alastair says, no Scotsman would ever eat store-bought haggis. And Duncan says, well, I'm a Scotsman and I eat store-bought haggis. So Duncan's provided a counter example to the generalization that Alastair's making there, right? Alastair makes a universal statement about all Scotsmen. In fact, he's making a statement about no Scotsman, right? Saying no Scotsman is ever going to eat store-bought haggis. And when Duncan provides his counterexample, instead of saying like, all right, so it's not no Scotsman, it's just that very few Scotsmen, or no self-respecting Scotsman would ever eat store-bought haggis. No, he says no true Scotsman, as if any counterexample that would be brought up wouldn't actually undermine the point that I'm trying to make. I'll just kind of conveniently define it out of the term. That seems like it's a very silly example, but we actually see this at work with a lot of political and cultural groups. So we might, hear people arguing about what it means to be a feminist, for example. I see this an awful lot with respect to feminism, that somebody will maybe offer up a straw man version of feminism and say, like, I've got a problem with feminism because feminists all hate men. And one way of addressing that would be to say, like, that seems like kind of a straw man version of what feminism is. Another way to do it is, another way that we see sometimes kind of coming the other way is that instead of, sorry, let me start that over. In response to this supposed straw man of feminism that suggests that all feminists hate men, somebody might say, no. It's not even that it's false that all feminists hate men. It's not even the essence of feminism to hate men. And somebody else might point out that, like, well, I know a lot of people that call themselves feminists, and they seem to hate men, and that's around the time that we might get a no true Scotsman appeal, something like that, like where we would say something like, well, in that case, they're just not true feminists. And it seems like this is the sort of thing that it's not obvious exactly how this is going to be adjudicated. We want to be careful that we don't let our terms be so ambiguous that I'm using the word one way and you're using the word a completely different way. We want to use the word in a consistent way, and we want to precisely define our terms, but we don't want to kind of over-determine what those terms mean either. And whether or not a fallacy is being committed here is going to require some careful attention. It's going to require all the parties who are involved in examining an argument, all the parties that are involved in a dispute or a discussion, to seriously stop and think about what it is that these terms mean and how they're going to be used in the conversation going forward. A comment on Weasel words as well, which basically means using vague and ambiguous language in ways where you can technically not be saying anything that's false, but you're kind of leading people to kind of believe things that go beyond that technical sense of what you've said. So, for example, we've got here, it's been said that Rosenfeld is the best living philosophy professor in America. That makes it seem like it's been said, I don't know, by many people, that it's been said by important people. It's been said right now, right? In reading that statement, it has been said that Rosenfeld is the best living philosophy professor in America. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, and technically it's true, but it's a little bit misleading, right? So yeah, it's been said, or people are saying, is a classic use of Weasel words there. All of these have to do with fallacies of ambiguity, and that's yet another whole family of fallacies, right? We looked at ones that are formal fallacies, we looked at ones that are ambiguous, we looked at ones where the subject is being changed, those were fallacies of relevance, and we looked at fallacies of presumption. Those were all of the fallacies that we just looked at today. So I want to close this little class session with a couple of questions. maybe kind of to just kind of recap this whole unit, and I'll point out that this question and the one after it, we got 2 questions here at the end. These 2 questions are going to be on the Section 1 quiz that's going to be posted shortly here. It's also going to be on your first exam, and I'm pretty sure these 2 questions are going to be on every exam for this class. So it's probably pretty important to get straight on this. The first question asks us, what is it that we learn about the conclusion of a good argument? And I've got 4 answer choices there. A, the conclusion is definitely true. B, there are good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. C, the conclusion can't possibly be false. And D, we learn nothing about the conclusion of a good argument. So right off the bat, if I'm trying to answer this question, I might note that A and C both seem to be saying exactly the same thing. And since we don't have an all of the above option on this, that seems like it might mean that A and C aren't the correct answer. So let me take a look at that and see if there's any way that I can rule out A and C. A says the conclusion is definitely true. Well, just because an argument's good doesn't mean that its conclusion is definitely true, right? A sound argument has a conclusion that's definitely true. But sound arguments aren't the only kinds of good arguments. We might also have, say, like a cogent argument, right? We could have an inductive argument whose conclusion isn't definitely true, but it's still good. And the same thing seems to be going on with C there as well. When we say the conclusion can't possibly be false, well, that's one kind of good argument, but it's not the only kind of good argument. So I'm not impressed with answer choice A or C. B looks pretty good. If an argument is good, then that means that I've provided good reasons to believe its conclusion. All right, I like that on B. And then D, well, D, that we learn nothing about the conclusion of a good argument, that seems pretty silly. So I'm inclined to go with B there. I hope you are as well. B is clearly the correct answer given these choices for this question. What is it that we learn about the conclusion of a good argument? Now this question isn't intended to be all that tricky. It's mostly intended to set up this next question, which asks, what is it that we learn about the conclusion of a bad argument? And where I find a lot of people get tempted on this is they want to think that somehow what we learn about the conclusion of a bad argument is similar to what we learn about the conclusion of a good argument, but somehow maybe inverted or somehow reversed. So again, we'll look at our answer choices. They're very similar to the answer choices on the last question, and right off the bat we might notice that A and C are saying pretty much the same thing, and they're a little bit too strong. So I'm going to want to rule out A and C, and then I'm left with answer choice B and D. Just on the basis of symmetry, because I thought that what I learned about the conclusion of a good argument was that there are good reasons to believe the conclusion is true, I might be led to think that a bad argument means that there's good reasons to believe that the conclusion is false. But I would be mistaken if I believed that. A good argument gives me good reasons to believe its conclusion. A bad argument just fails to give me good reasons to believe its conclusion. Does that make sense? A bad argument just fails to give good reasons. And failing to give good reasons isn't the same as giving me good reasons to believe that something is false. It just means that I haven't been given good reasons to believe that it's true yet. The way that this ends up working is that a bad argument actually tells me nothing about the conclusion, right? That's what's bad about a bad argument. And we can think of all sorts of arguments that are terrible, terrible arguments. And the issue isn't that they give me reasons to believe that the conclusion is false. The issue with them is that they don't tell me anything about my conclusion at all. For example, I might say something like, my middle name is Mark, my mom's name is Donna, my sister just had a baby recently, therefore tomorrow is Saturday. All of those statements are true. It's a terrible argument because the premises just have nothing to do with the conclusion. They tell me nothing about the truth or falsity of their conclusion. So keep this in mind. A good argument gives you good reasons to believe that its conclusion is true. A bad argument just tells you nothing at all. All right. Hopefully that was very helpful. If not, if you're confused about anything, feel free to contact me. There's going to be a worksheet posted that goes along with this, along with solutions to that worksheet. There's going to be a homework assignment, and there's going to be our first section quiz all posted this afternoon. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll talk to you later.